Today's lecture falls under the Empowerment of Women and Peace series, one of a number of ongoing series organized by the Baha'i Chair to explore possible solutions to some of the world's greatest challenges, challenges of inequalities and injustices. Now, it's not going to be easy for me to introduce Professor Milani because I've known her for many years and I have respected her work over all of those years. And all I can say is that I guess it's fate in life that sometimes things happen. And I end up in University of Maryland and she is at the University of Virginia, and the Baha'i Chair is so fortunate to have her today. And I can't say enough about her. She is considered a highly accomplished, respected, and eminent scholar, but also as a human being. She manifests excellence and dignity, integrity in everything that she does. Professor Milani is Raymond J. Nelson Professor and Chair of the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures, and former Director of Studies in Women and Gender at the University of Virginia. She has published a number of books, most recently, Words, Not Swords, Iranian Women Writers and the Freedom of Movement, which has won a prize, and I'm not surprised. And she has published over 100 articles, epilogues, forewords, afterwords, in both Persian and English. She has served as guest editor for special issues of Nimeh Digar, Persian language feminist journal, Iran Nameh, and Iranian Studies, Journal of the International Society of Iranian Studies. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Christian Science Monitor, Ms. Magazine, Reader's Digest, USA Today, and contributed to the National Public Radio's All Things Considered. She's been past president of the Association of Middle Eastern Women's Studies in America and a Carnegie Fellow. Professor Milani was the recipient of the All-University Teaching Award in 1998 and nominated for Virginia Faculty of the Year in 1999. That only covers half of the picture. What you will hear today will manifest for you the amazing scholar that Professor Milani is. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Milani to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I feel honored to be here this afternoon after such an incredibly kind and generous introduction. Dean Ball honors me with his presence. Thank you, sir, for being here. And every single one of you, I'm grateful for your presence. Thank you for giving me the chance to share with you some thoughts on women writers in Iran. I think the general outline of what I'm about to say will apply to the Islamic world in general. Allow me to begin by saying that I think if there is any hope, it's in peace, it's in the power of words, and I take great pride in the fact that Iranian women writers have been at the forefront of the caravan of women leading us to peace. Before doing that, I also need to acknowledge a couple of colleagues who are here in the audience. My dear friend, Dr. Keshavarz, from whose writing I have learned a great deal. I'm honored with your presence. Another wonderful writer in her own presence, Mona Khademi, thank you for being here, and many other, all of you. So I had prepared a written talk, but I see it's a wonderful, diverse group, and it's a cozy group. So with your permission, if it's agreeable with you, I would prefer to just speak. I have a PowerPoint, so at least it will lead me. And please feel free to stop me at any point if there is something that was not clear, if my accent was an obstacle, or if you want me to repeat, or you want to challenge me, I welcome it. So, in Iran, as many of you know, in the last 160 years, 170 years, and in a minute you will know why I begin with 170 years ago, we've had a number of upheavals, an 8-year war, coup d'etats, but we've also had 2 revolutions. The 1905-1911 Constitutional Revolution and the 1979 Islamic Revolution. My argument for the last 10 years has been that a third, more consequential revolution has also happened in Iran. It's a bloodless revolution. It does not match our understanding and the traditional definition of revolutions, but it has, in fact, shaken the foundation of my country of birth in ways that hopefully by the end of this presentation you will be convinced have been more long-lasting, have been more important than the other 2 revolutions. I will call it a women's revolution, with a caveat. I take great pride in being a feminist, but I've never believed that there is a division between men and women. This is a women's revolution, but it has been supported by men. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, at least in Iran, it would have not happened had it not been for the support, for the generosity of spirit, and for the spirit of equality and equity of fathers, sons, brothers, lovers, teachers. So if I use the word revolution, women's revolution, please keep that in mind, that I'm not dividing the society in the binary opposites of men and women. I don't believe in that. So this third revolution has a number of characteristic features, and I will want to talk a little bit about every single one of them. First and foremost, for me, is that it has adopted a non-violent policy. From its beginning, it has argued against the futility of fighting violence with violence. It is not going to take us anywhere. Violence begets violence. So if there is any hope for the Middle East, for North Africa, for the Islamic world in general, and perhaps for the globe we live in, it's in peace rather than in fight. So I'm so delighted that the chair you have is called World Peace. This revolution had a number of characteristic features other than its non-violence nature. It's based on desegregating the Iranian society, and in a minute I will tell you why I think this is so important. It has redefined democracy. You know, we keep talking about democracy, and it has, to me, a very restrictive definition. It's as if democracy is only the monopoly of politicians, that we can scream all we want and have slogans about democracy, And when we get inside the home, to turn into divorce tyrants. That to me is not democracy. And I think women writers in particular have redefined the very definition of democracy. You cannot redefine democracy in a segregated society like mine if you don't redefine masculinity and femininity. And we will discuss that more in detail. And of course, if you've done all these things, it leads to integration of the social discourse, diversification of it, one that is no longer either masculine or feminine, but combines the two. Semin Behbahani, our national poet, not recognized as such by our regime, but by our people inside and outside the country, whom we lost a few months ago. And the Iranian people inside gave her one of the most amazing burial ceremonies. It was truly beautiful. They delivered the body of this voice of dissent and integrity to her final resting place. And they did it with the dignity she deserved. One of her most beautiful poems, and I'm sorry I won't have time to read the whole poem or to read them in Persian, so that I will stay within the confine of my 50 minutes. But look at these words. She said them when she was 80 years old, in her 80s, when she had already seen revolutions and coups d'etats and 8-year war with Iraq. Said, my poems are my sword. They're mightier than any sword. And she really believed that. Though they can cut deep, my fine weapon is not for bloodshed. Imagine how much meaning is packed in these short 4 lines. She recognizes there is a need for struggle, but that struggle is not going to be a bloody one. Her weapons, and believe me, words can be more explosive than bombs. They can be more lethal than guns. They can be more infiltrating than drones. They do things. They change societies. Shirin Ebadi, the first Iranian woman who won a Nobel Peace, who is a laureate, said, words are the most powerful tool we have to protect ourselves, both from the tyrants of the day and from our own traditions. Now, I said that I'm going to talk about a few things that Iranian women have accomplished in the last 160, 170 years. Sex segregation, to me, is the most important one. As you know, I don't believe Islam in its core teaching segregated men and women. Women accompanied the Prophet to war. Women, there is a whole chapter in the Quran, Mujadale, women who argued with the Prophet, who had that much discursive power to actually challenge their Prophet. And in the early years of Islam, there were some Muslim women who were teachers, leaders of their community. You know, the first wife of the Prophet was 15 years older than himself. But over the years, sex segregation, which is the division of the social order based on gender. In other words, in most Islamic countries, not all of them, but in the overwhelming majority, of Muslim countries, there is a separation of space. And by space, I mean all kinds of space: discursive space, physical space, literary space, based on gender. Men owned the streets, the public arena, public spaces. Women were confined to what was known as the private domain. Now, the private domain can have different meanings in different times. There are women in villages in Iran who go and do the farms. But if you go to the center of that same village, all the coffee shops are populated by men. So you won't see a single woman there. So the definition of the private space is different. So this sex segregation, to me, is the cause of many of the things that have happened in the Islamic world in the last 500-600 years. Half the population were denied their rights, and the country was denied the privilege of taking advantage of half its population in the public arena. Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights tells us that everyone has the right of freedom of movement. And I want to tell you that sex segregation denies contact between men and women. That's common to the two genders. What is different is that men are the ones who have all the mobility they want. They can go anywhere they want. They can travel. To this day, as a grandmother, if I want to leave the country of my birth, Iran, I still need the written permission of my legal guardian. If I'm married, it's my husband. If I'm a widow, it's going to be my eldest son. He needs to give me permission to leave my own country. I will not be issued a passport without his permission. Without that freedom of movement, you will be denied access to all of these things. Institution of higher education, you need to leave home to go to universities, to colleges. Think of Taliban. They literally put women under house arrest. Again, I want to repeat, I don't think the Taliban have anything to do with Islam. It's, well, you can say they're Muslim too. At least they don't have anything to do with my understanding of Islam. But how could you gain higher education if you are a prisoner of your home? They can't have access to centers of power. They can't have political representation, economic rights. They can't have easy access to the arts, the public forms of arts, and I will come back to that, labor force, and of course to the pulpit. The pulpit, for centuries, was monopolized by men. And we know how important that is. Now, you remember that Virginia Woolf, in one of her masterpieces, A Room of One's Own, said this wonderful sentence that, that a woman needs a room of her own and economic dependence to become a writer, to become an independent person in her own right. I love Virginia Woolf. She's one of my most favorite writers. With much humility, I would like to add to that statement. That statement does not apply to the Islamic world. I think what we also need, other than a room of our own, other than economic independence, which was granted to us anyway 13 centuries ago, is the permission, the right to leave that room and to return to it at will. Because a room without that is a prison cell. You remember the argument of Michel Foucault, one of the most important philosophers of the 20th century. He argued that the birth of prison is congruent with the birth of modernity. For centuries in Iran, masculinity was designed and defined in relation to space. Mobility was desired in men. In fact, it was a prerequisite of manliness. Can you imagine Rostam without his horse Rash? He is so important, he even has a name. And there are certain women who don't have name in our literature. They're the mother of this and the sister of that. Rostam's horse has a name. Now, I want to take a few minutes of your precious time to put that in a global context, although to a different degree. I would argue that freedom of movement is still the monopoly of men. Women have access to mobility, more in some countries and less in others, but it is still the same, even in Western societies. Can you imagine John Wayne without his horse? I want to give you a few other examples. You know that Don Quixote, who is considered by many the first modern character, and the novel is considered by many the first modern novel. And why? Many literary critics have argued because Don Quixote decided to leave the village she lived in. Again, you cannot imagine Don Quixote without his donkey and his sidekick, of course. Think about the two signs of masculinity and femininity. You know, one is Mirror of Venus, and one is the Weapons of Mars. Look at that. Masculinity is free. Sky is the limit. Unattached, can go anywhere. And look at the sign of femininity. Held in a mirror. In other words, we are all prisoners of our body and our beauty. And deeply attached to the earth. Now, one could say there are lots of benefits to that. This is attached, this is balanced, and it is indeed. Nothing in life is only goodness or evil. But from the perspective that I'm talking about today, the issue of mobility, which is the right of every modern citizen in the West, Article 13 of the Declaration of Human Rights, and how it wasn't always granted women. Sex segregation is the best example of it. Foot binding in China. The similarities between foot binding and segregation are many and amazing. Foot binding literally paralyzed women, cut their feet. The ideal woman had a foot of 3.5 inches. 3.5 inches. Of course, a woman like that is not going to be mobile and running around and invading the streets. And of course, the most famous, the most popular fairy tale in the world. There are at least 600 different variations of it all over the world. It's not the monopoly of any one country. What is the qualification of Cinderella that stands out the most? It's her tiny little feet. Cinderella had the smallest feet in the country. That's why she went from rags to riches. It would be interesting for you to know, and perhaps you already know, that the oldest written version of Cinderella comes from China, around 10th century, congruent with the beginning of foot binding. So even to this day, the ideal of femininity, even in the West, and I invite you to take a look at Barbie doll. You know her feet are bound and mutilated. Barbie doll is a tall woman, has a lot of weight in her breasts, probably 1/4 of it, has the feet of a 4.5 or 5 toddler. She can never stand on her own 2 feet. Think about the significance of that phrase, to be able to stand on your own 2 feet. Barbie, the ideal of Western femininity, cannot do that. Now, of course, our literature is filled with sleeping beauties, both in Iran and in the West and in the East. Sleeping beauties and Ophelias and Snow White, and the list can go on and on. Maybe in Q&A we can talk more about it. One last example, and I will move on. If the ideal woman is the one who is confined and restricted in her movement and mobility of body and voice, a woman who knows how to keep silent, who is the counter-ideal woman? The witch. The witch, and in most cultures, how are witches portrayed? Flying on their broomsticks, the very sign and symbol of their domesticity, turned into a vehicle, able to carry them to forbidden places. Imagine the fear of women's mobility that goes beyond one culture, one faith, one period. Chastity and space in the West, you know, women for decades, for centuries, could not ride on horse. The men did. It had to be side saddle. And when women started in the West, the suffragettes, when started riding bicycles, you know, I won't have time to go into the details. I love that story. There was something called a bicycle smile at the beginning of the 19th century in the West. And you know what was bicycle smile? Because women were so eager to have access to these bicycles. It could take them places. This was freedom. So those who were against it said that these women derived sexual gratification from the saddle. But commerce is always smarter than the rest of us. They came up with a solution. And if you Google, early bicycles for women had a hole in the saddle. So to take care of that bicycle smile. I mean, honestly, so even if they did, why are we so jealous of that? What's wrong? I could never figure that out. So when you know that women suffragettes were often portrayed with their bicycles in a negative sense, and when women were admitted to different universities, there were effigies of women burned on their bicycles. Because it just meant women were now entering an otherwise all-male territory. Universities were occupied by men. Now, with this digression, I want to go back to Iran and women writers. You know that Iran has a glorious literary tradition. we have over 11 centuries of truly one of the world's treasure. It has not been recognized in the world yet, as much as it should be, although I'm delighted to know, and we have the expert on Rumi among us. Rumi is the #1 best-selling author in this country, and we are grateful for that, to the readers and to the poets and to those who translate him and propagate his words. But generally speaking, especially modern literature, there is a dearth of translation. In fact, I'm embarrassed to say my country of adoption, the country I love, has one of the worst records of translation in the world. The Islamic Republic of Iran translates more books by thousands than the American industry. So in the West, you have a lot of paintings of women in the act of reading everywhere, in various genres of poetry, of painting. I have rarely seen any painting in which an Iranian woman is caught in the act of writing with a pencil in hand. After 19th century, with Kamalul Mulk, things began to change. And of course now, I'm sure you're familiar, Iranian women, right? There is a renaissance of art among Iranian women, and there is plenty of it. So in spite of that, there has been an attempt to own and to appropriate the writing pen. So what are some of the themes that are most common to the writing of women in Iran? I would argue today with you 3 major things, other than their desire for democracy and the non-violent form of it. I would argue captivity is one, flight and the desire to go places is the other, and familial reform, which basically I think is probably the most important, is the next one. And I'm going to take a few minutes of your time and discuss each of these separately. I love this painting because it captures exactly what I believe in, that you cannot talk about women in Iran, nor can you talk about thematic concerns of women writers in Iran without presenting these two side by side. Yes, there are feelings of captivity, and for good reason. But there is just equally as much the desire for flight, for going places, for being free and unshackled. And this little painting just captures that. Feet are in shackles, and yet the mind, and you can never deprive people of their imagination or of their dreams. And there are nothing but birds flying there. So I told you that I want to begin the tradition of Iranian women writers with Tahireh Qurratullain. I have done so for the last 30 years, not because of any affiliation. I'm not a Baha'i, I'm not a Babi, but because I genuinely believe that's where the tradition of women writers in Iran began. Tahireh was a poet. She was also a religious figure, but I'm not a religious scholar, so I'm not going to discuss that part of her. I'm going to discuss her role as a poet. I'm going to discuss her role as a woman activist. I went to Seneca Falls a few years ago to give a talk. And when they had kindly invited me, they said, "We're going to have a surprise for you." They had invited me because they wanted me to talk about interfaith dialogue and the role of Qurratul Ain. So I went there, and this is what I found at Seneca Falls Convention. One side is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and I'm sure some of you know her. By many, she's considered the mother of the women's movement in the West. On this side is Tahireh Qurratul Ain, a woman who also should be considered a pioneer and a foremother of the women's movement, of women's liberation and men's liberation. When you liberate women in your society, you also liberate men. A society that is based on inequality dehumanizes both men and women. To me, that's the most important lesson to learn from the attempt of all these men and women. I'm going to read one of her poems to you. It's probably one of her most anthologized. I have to say, some argue that it's not hers in my country. Even if it's not, she has been singing it all her life. She loved this poem, and as far as I'm concerned, even if she didn't write it, she believed in the central thesis of this poem, of these lines of poetry. Personally, I think it is her poem anyway. And I have to tell you, in Persian, it is exquisite. Please allow me to just read one line of it. گر به تو افتادم نظر چهره به چهره رو به رو شرح دهم غم دلا نکته به نکته مو به مو. And it goes on like that. Many Iranian singers have put it to music, a number of them. So a poor translation of it, my own, does not do justice to the Persian. I would explain all my grief dot by dot, point by point. If heart to heart we talk and face to face we meet. To catch a glimpse of you, I'm wandering like the wind, from house to house, from door to door, from place to place, from street to street. Separated from you, the blood of my heart gushes from my eyes, in torrent after torrent, river after river, in wave upon wave, stream after stream. This afflicted heart of mine has woven your love to the stuff of my life, strand by strand, thread by thread. What is so significant about this poem? And why? Tahireh was considered such a dangerous woman. She is still considered a heretic in the country of her birth, a country that should take pride in her. Things written about her cannot be translated. None of my books have been translated in Persian. There's been a few courageous, valiant translators who wanted to translate them with one condition. I had to cut my chapter on Qurratul Ain. And I said, I will never do that. I have come to this conclusion that she is a pioneering woman, a forerunner, and I will wait for the day when the book will be published, translated eventually. And I think it will be translated. So I want to show you something of the significance of her act and why she is so dangerous. There is a grave of Tahireh Qurratul Ain was accused of murdering her father-in-law. So there is a grave, a mausoleum in the city of Qazvin, where the father-in-law is buried to rest. On the gravesite is this picture. And I have to tell you, it's a very unusual phenomenon. Muslims don't paint on tombstones. And there is an engraving on this tombstone. It is because they didn't want a professional photographer. I had to take these photographs, and I'm challenged when it comes to technology. So it's not a very good photograph, but if you see, there are two men killing the father-in-law, and there is a woman holding a piece of paper behind the curtain. Lesson one, the significance of education. After all, Qurratul Ain was a highly educated woman and wanted to educate other women. Look at this other one. This is a painting from another book in which Qurratul Ain this time is with a glass of wine. In other words, let's use everything we can to turn this woman into something more fearful that she needs to be. Or maybe she is fearful. She indicates the death of an era that was based on the rule of the old patriarch. So what about women writers and in post-revolutionary Iran? And I've jumped a little bit, of course, from the middle of the 19th century to post-revolutionary period, because I don't have a lot of time. I can tell you, you will see that some of these will give you statistics, facts, to tell you that indeed a renaissance is happening in Iran. Not because of the ruling elite in Iran, maybe in spite of them. We all talk about the collateral damages of war. I talk about the collateral benefits of the Islamic Republic. That, one of them, was this renaissance in women's writing, painting, music, photography, cinematography. The number of women directors we have in Iran is beyond imagination. Nobody could have imagined it even 20 years ago. So look at these numbers. These are women novelists. In the 1960s, we had a handful of women. In 1999, we had less than 30. And now we have more than 370 women novelists in Iran. Number of women translators. In 1997, we had 214. In 2003, we have 708. And these days, we have a lot more. I haven't been able to get my hand on reliable statistics. And I have to give credit to Mr. Mir Dam Ebrahimi for some of these statistics. He has done a great job collecting these data. A number of women working in Iranian publishing industry, 700 in 1997, 2,000 in 2003, and even number of women publishers. And I can't tell you how important it is to have women publishers, because men and women write differently. And to recognize that, you need women publishers. Literacy rate and these statistics, I'm gonna not take too much of your time with it. They're available online and everything. Campaign for 1 million signature, which has been really a proud moment. in women's movement in Iran. And I have to tell you, I find it fascinating that for their motto, although they have not assigned it to Qurratul Ain, but they have used the phrase from the poem that I read you, street to street, face to face. So that tells you that the thesis I presented you with at the beginning, that there is a revolution going on, and that women writers have been at the forefront of this revolution is not such an exaggeration. I'm going to just change my, give you a couple of quotations by, it's not working. Okay, so I was going to give you a couple of lines by Farzaneh Etisami, 5 minutes. Okay. And of course, the iconic woman poet whose life and work I absolutely love, Farzaneh. But I want to talk in the five remaining minutes, and I'm sorry I didn't budget my time properly, because this is also very important. Women writers, from day one of this tradition, in other words, in almost 2 centuries, have challenged lines of power within the family. Now, for many literary critiques, this has been considered unimportant, private, juvenile, confessional. These are some of the words used for these women who are talking about democracy inside the home. They're talking about the rights of men and women to be equal, day in and day out inside the house. That is not considered political. If you talk about changing a few leaders on top, going from Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi to Ayatollah Khomeini and then to Ayatollah Khamenei, that is politics. But changing the very structure of Iranian family is considered not political enough. You know, Farzaneh's early poetry, she has written 5 poetry collections. The first 3 poetry collections, which was mainly about her challenging fathers, brothers, husbands, lovers, that was considered not political enough. The minute she started talking about, I feel sorry for the garden, or somebody will come to save me, that was considered political. I think women writers have changed the definition of both politics and democracy. Talking about gender relations inside a family unit is most political. You cannot have democracy in a country if you don't have democracy at home. Political democracy is incumbent upon gender equity inside the house. So how have women accomplished this? They have redefined femininity. Femininity is no longer a definition of being confined. Women, you can now be women and have a high education. You can be a poet and a writer, or and a good mother. They have expanded the definition of motherhood. You know, in Persian, we say paradise is under the feet of mothers, or بهشت زیر پای مادران است. It's not a good translation, but I don't know how else to translate it. I say Persian literature is under the feet of mothers. Mothers have been eulogized in Persian literature like no one else. But it's a special kind of mother. It's a mother who has no identity other than motherhood. It's a mother like the famous poem of Iraj Mirza, داد معشوقه به عاشق پیغام که کند مادر تو با من جنگ. So, you know, the age-old struggle between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law. So the son, the young woman says, if you want my union, you have to go kill your mother and bring me the heart of that mother. And this man, who is not eulogized in the poem, but runs and kills the mother and is running with the bleeding heart to go find the woman, the beloved, and he falls. And the poem tells us, and this is one of the best poems about motherhood in my country. All of us know it by heart. The heart said, oh, my little prince, his knee is hurting. Ah, پای پسرم خورد به سنگ. That's the kind of mother that is eulogized. Women have changed the definition of motherhood. Furugh Farrokhzad is the best example of it. Yes, I can be a poet, and I can be a mother. In fact, I can go adopt a son, and I can expand the definition of motherhood to adoption as well. So, in Persian weddings, damad, the groom, is called king groom, Shah damad. There are lots of proverbs too. Shab zafaf kam az subh padashahi nist. The nuptial night is no less than ascending a throne. What does that tell you? That there was an unequal relationship between husband and wife. That, just like the word kat khoda in Persian, khoda, of course, is khoda. Kat means home, house. So husband, which originally kat khoda meant a husband, meant the God at home. So women are challenging these. And they're challenging not only for themselves, they're also doing a favor to the men who had to carry the burden of being God on earth. I wouldn't want that. I really wouldn't want that. So matrimony, therefore, is no longer the beginning of sovereignty, albeit without crown and thrones. And I want to end with the fact that it hasn't been only women. Men have been equally criticized by other men who felt threatened by these women for supporting these kind of women. I can give you the example of Jalal al-Ahmad, who called these little Foucaults and westernized little men who didn't know what was going on, who were working inside the house like women, and who allowed their women to be in the public arena. My own uncle, Dr. Shadaman, whom I love and I think has contributed fantastically to Persian literature, he called them the Foucaults. And of course, Ayatollah Khomeini has written extensively about these men who didn't know, who copied Westerners, and in the process were robbed of patriarchy. Indeed, they were robbed of one kind of patriarchy, but to gain an egalitarian relationship, to give the gift of democracy to their family, and to help Iran gain democracy. Thank you for your patience.